Um, uh, I wanted to ask you whether this idea of uselessness in relation to usefulness is something that emerges. I think you did speak a bit about the history, I mean, the Renaissance art and the Enlightenment. Is this something that is a problem that we encounter specifically in modernity? And secondly, there's also the branch of aesthetics, I think, that deals with turning the useless into the useful, right?
Sorry, just say that again.
Turning the useless into the useful. And I'm thinking particularly here of, say, Brechtian aesthetics or that particular terrain where the idea is to convert the useless into some kind of, into something that's useful for society, or useful for the world in some way. So I wanted to know, what would your comment on that be? The conversion of the useless into the useful within the framework of aesthetics, and
conversion of the useless into the useful.
Yeah. Also because I feel that within an academic setting, so much of what we are trained to do is to, in a sense, sort of reconfigure the center. We're not really thinking, you spoke about the center early on in your lecture, reconfigure the center or bring all our knowledge to yet in the end bear on an idea of the center. So even if there are domains of uselessness in the world around us, they are ultimately, brought again to cohere with the idea of the center, brought into the frame of the useful is what I'm trying to say. So just your comments on that.
How does the useless get converted into the useful or appropriated by the center? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. I'm thinking of
somewhere on the side.
Yeah.
No, I'm just thinking of, sort of a certain kind of, the politics.
Can you
of
give
art.
me a couple of examples or one example of what you mean?
The idea that art must be useful in some way. What is it doing in society? Is it changing the world in some way? I'm referring to, and that also is a very powerful sort of strand in thinking about art in the 20th century, if not earlier. So, and that basically works with converting the idea of the useless into the useful, so to speak.
So I'm trying to sort of query this particular dichotomy when I sort of speak about the importance of and also the nature of the form of uselessness. And I'm trying to reformulate the language and the terms in which we think about these things. And I'm also looking at alternative traditions and spaces in which things that play a particular role in, let us say, in more useful domains, let us say academic writing, scholarly writing being one of them, play a completely different role in these other alternative domains. Let me try and give you some examples of what I mean and what it is one is grappling with, because the notion of usefulness, of course, is pervasive. So one is not trying to say throughout the notions of usefulness, but somehow step aside from this dichotomy. let me give some examples, just throw up some thoughts in reply to what you said and continuing what I said earlier. The quotation in an essay. What role does the quotation play in an essay? The quotation in an essay has no clear scholarly function. It is part of a thought process. It also connects the writer to a configuration of thoughts in the world of writing, which are arrived at through a mixture of association and intention. So the quotation in an essay is very different from the quotation in a scholarly work, where the quotation is there to buttress a point and to legitimize it. So we are moving outside in an essay the space of legitimacy into a more ambiguous space. The quotation is not legitimizing by making a connection with Benjamin or Hegel or whoever. One is not legitimizing what one is saying. One is creating a kind of network of associations and reproducing a thought process, moving from one thing to another. So in that sense, the quote in the essay does not have, in the scholarly sense, a clear use in terms of adding to the veracity of the argument, etc. So I'm interested in a kind of writing where learning might be displayed with passion, but where it has no particular use as it would in a scholarly work. Learning does not have any particular use over there. Yet one is arguing against various things as one is formulating one's thought, but not according to the conventions of use in a scholarly piece of writing or a scholarly discipline. One is much more anarchic and random and ambiguous in the way one is arguing, and therefore constantly reformulating the terms as that particular kind of writing, say of the essay, continues. Again, now, I would want to give two examples of, I'd like to give an example of what constitutes, on one level, an idea of knowledge. And an idea of knowledge is, on some crass level, comprises what Kant called the mathematical sublime. That is, we know more and more. Now, I want to talk about potatoes. So I go and research about potatoes, and I read every book on potatoes. It's a Borgesian project, but ideally this is what I should be doing. I should read all the books on potatoes before I make a comment about potatoes. This is what Kant calls the mathematical sublime, an idea of infinity where you go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, and then you keep wondering, okay, what comes after 3 million? And then what comes after 5 million? And then you go further off into space, and what comes after that? And this ambition of encompassing infinity through, as it were, capturing it, whether it's through numbers or by journeying further and further in space, or thinking of its negative side, that is not knowing, as taking away what you know. So -1, -2, you have less and less, which is a form of kind of nihilism. This is what Kant calls the mathematical sublime. And I see this ambition of wanting to know more and more, adding quotes, going to the archive, doing more and more research. If this is our idea of history, then it follows, or historical writing, this follows completely the model of Kant's mathematical sublime. Now, in here is this useless concept, which might be a Buddhistic concept, I don't know, the zero. The zero is an absence which is also a plenitude. It is a very strange thing. It is not minus one. It is not simply a taking away. It is a presence. But what is it? It's certainly not 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. So, zero as a useless concept, which is neither negative nor positive, and which falls out of the purview of the mathematical sublime, where you want to know everything. But zero as being this shunyata, shunya, which is not a reduction, which is an opening up. Shunya is an aperture which also opens up. This is something that is an instructive piece of uselessness. And I think a lot of Western modernity, a lot of modernity is an attempt to understand this plenitude, which is nothing, but it is also a rejection of this plenitude. A lot of modernity, I would say the Hegelian position, Hegel's position, is to reject this. So Hegel, when he encounters the Gita and the dissertation on the Gita by von Humboldt, when was it, in 1826 or 1827, rejects the nothingness of the Gita, as he calls it, and later, as Nietzsche called it, the nothingness of Buddhism, as a form of nihilism. They see it as a negative. But modernism keeps returning to this nothing. And it's wrong to see it as a negative. It sees it as a positive. To go back to your idea, can the useless be converted into the useful? In the sense, the negative that the zero is can be converted into something that is there, but not useful in a conventional sense. But certainly modernism's attempt is to convert nothing into a form of plenitude. And much of the intellectual antecedents of that comes from his exposure to other cultures where nothing might have served as a form of plenitude. But then there is also the resistance to it in Hegel, and the resistance to it in a person like Nietzsche, who I think learns a great deal from Buddhism through Schopenhauer, but otherwise too. What he learns from Buddhism, I think, is a rejection of categorical absolutes. So when Nietzsche says, God is dead, I think he cannot have said that without having been exposed to Buddhism. But at the same time, he takes on the Hegelian position when he's public about Buddhism in The Birth of Tragedy, and he says, Buddhism, what is it? It's nothing. It's all about nothingness. It's a kind of nihilism. And that is the position that one has had to struggle with, and that modernism has had to struggle with, that nothing is not necessarily nihilism or negative. It is a form of fullness. Now, many of us in the 70s, for instance, saw a whole bunch of writers as being part of a nihilist kind of project. We thought Camus was a nihilist. We thought Beckett was a nihilist. We thought Kafka was a nihilist. We thought Bergman was a nihilist. Much later, now when we review them, we see that Kafka was an extremely funny writer. He was full of laughter. He was also a wonderful realist. He was a very poetic realist. If you look at the way he wrote Metamorphosis and his description of the room of the giant insect and what the giant insect ends up eating, because he has lost his appetite for normal food, he ends up eating rotten food or rotting food. You find that this is a writer with an extremely lyrical and precise sense of reality, Kafka. But earlier, one had just mistaken his writing for nihilist allegories. Beckett is an extremely carnal, corporeal, humorous writer. Bergman is full of carnality and sensuousness, but one never saw it because if one takes on the Hegelian position, all one sees over there is a kind of nihilism. Camus is a writer who loved Algeria and sunlight. This we had not noticed before. We, Orwell is another such writer. We only saw him as a writer of Animal Farm and 1984 as nihilist projects, you know. Only later did we understand he was a man who loved food and tea. So what I'm saying is that the same things that earlier on might have seemed nihilistic or negative, with a slight shift of the lens, you find they're actually full of life. They're full of the gradations and nuances of life. Those very same artists and writers have that sense of life most powerfully and subtly.
We don't have a lot of time.
Yeah.
We'll slowly be going for the classes. Albina? She also teaches English.
Thank you for a very thought-provoking talk. And I'm sorry, I'm tempted to ask you a question referring to your book.
Sorry, which book?
The book that you edited was a revolutionary in terms of Indian literature. But I'm not going in the history of the tradition of literary criticism that you have mentioned. I have two very banal questions. Because you mentioned pedagogy.
Mention what, sorry?
Pedagogy.
Pedagogy. Okay.
So first is that since the economic crisis, both in North America and in continental universities, there has been a debate over the crisis of humanities, austerity measures, funds being dried up, and a very fundamental question being asked, particularly of literature and the creative fields, that what is your usefulness? Why on earth should you fund it? So is your inquiry into uselessness, because a lot of creative as well as literary scholars have spent a lot of time trying to argue out the usefulness of literature, of humanities, of music, etc. So in rejecting that paradigm of defending the discipline or creativity in terms of usefulness, are you responding to that entire debate? That's my question number one. Question number two, very quickly, is that we are, at least as teachers, teaching a generation of students who are millennials. They are considerably different from us. And even though in literature and creativity, what much of what you referred to was modernity, the psychological, the sort of dwelling on nothing, the lack of plot. But since then, in the postmodern terrain, there has been much of dwelling on that paranoia, schizophrenia, etc., are far more reflective of the complete ambiguous, arbitrary universe that we live in. Now, my students, for instance, I think it's wired in their thought process, in the DNA of their thought process, that they've grown up on the internet, and which has a lot of hypertexts. So somebody may start reading a serious piece on, say, Matthew Arnold, but see a hypertext on the best football goal in FIFA and just go there, and there see a hypertext on, depression of Viveka Balagoon and go and read a little bit of there and not really complete any of the pieces they're reading, and then go from interesting things to interesting things. Now this gets reflected in how students write, and there is not necessarily a conclusion, not necessarily a structure. As teachers, we are constantly dissatisfied. We try to teach them academic writing, we try to teach a lot of things, but by now academic writing has been taught for over 20 decades. There is a lot of sense that that's not necessarily achieving the kind of goals it's supposed to achieve. I find that allowing my students to multitasking in class, as in they look also at their phone and also check out their laptop and catch up on some chat during the class, makes them slightly more alert to parts of the lecture. So, how do you deal with this? Because you said, and that sounded envious to me, that your students are extremely attentive for the critical writing class.
Yeah, they are. They are disturbingly attentive. Was there any other question or you wanted to ask, and then we can wind it up maybe.
Yeah.
I'll come back to both of your questions. Okay, so just maybe two people and then we.
Yeah, you finish off and then.
I'll just hear hers first and then I'll take yours. So the first one was about what's happening in the universities. Then it was about hypertext or links, right? And then yours.
I also have a couple of questions, if you don't mind. There's a very famous quote by Oscar Wilde that all art is essentially useless. And your entire speech reminded me of that quote. Some people tend to appreciate art because of its uselessness, I would say. So what are your comments about the dichotomy of the entire situation, that when we tend to appreciate the uselessness, why are we so rigid in our upbringing about finding useful purpose in our lives? And secondly, because you mentioned Buddhism, do you think uselessness is a spiritual practice that you would advocate for? Because it does, in a way, I feel would bring peace to our lives, to not be aware of everything around us, also not want to be aware of everything around us.
Okay, great. That's the third.
I have a very straightforward question. That you said that the purpose of a form of uselessness is about having a purposive value or nature to purposelessness. Or you said that it is a shift from consciousness to certain amount of subconsciousness. So I want to ask that how this idea or this form of uselessness is very different from the concept of negative capability, and how it is very much different from if it moves from consciousness to subconsciousness, how it is very different from the whole idea of stream of subconsciousness.
So one by one. So you remember, like, in Chaturthai Aurangzeb, I think there's a memory game, So somebody will have to do that, what Sharmila Tagore does, basically. She remembers each one of the. Okay, so let me answer these three and then we'll go to you and then we'll finish it. Yeah. So I think, yeah, absolutely, you're completely right about what is happening to the universities in the UK and I know the UK better than I know the US, where really not even the old terms of pedagogical importance, but new commercial terms like impact have been brought in. And this is why today the problem is always to re-examine the language in which value is being stated, and to do it on one's toes in a state of alertness, because as I was saying, I was discussing with somebody earlier, maybe with you, that the market never really expresses itself in terms of the market, that is a market gain. It generally expresses itself in terms of value, of human value. It does not mention the fact that the value it is actually talking about is a reified value, the value of capital. So I'll give you an example of that, which I was discussing earlier and which I've written about quite often, that now, ever since 1993, which I see as a kind of landmark, or 1992 landmark year, when publishers in the UK and US really became whatever they call themselves, and literary publishing became a kind of mainstream marketing term. Since then, all publishers have acted on behalf of market values, but have never said that they are doing so. So they appropriated terms which had gone out of fashion in the literary departments, terms of value like masterpiece and classic, canon of course, but all these terms were supposed to indicate an elitist culture which had lost its validity. So those terms were looked upon with suspicion and wariness in the literature departments, where they fell out of use once you reached your third year undergraduate year, and certainly when you were doing your PhD, nobody spoke in terms of masterpieces and classics anymore. So they went out of circulation there, and they were appropriated by literary publishers who would only speak in terms of literary value when they meant market value. So literary publishers very rarely say, we are publishing a book because we think it is going to sell 10,000 or 50,000 or 100,000 copies. What they will say is, we are publishing a work of great literary merit, or we are about to publish a masterpiece. Or even, we are, although this sounds counter to the flow of linear time as we have known it, we are about to publish a classic. You know, the great example of this is Morrissey, the rock star's autobiography, which he bargained with Penguin for them to publish it not in terms of the size of the advance they were giving him, but for them to publish it under the Penguin Classics imprint. He said, if you want to publish my autobiography, you have to publish it not as a Penguin book, not as a Penguin modern classic, but as a Penguin classic. And they said, okay, we'll publish it as a Penguin classic. And it went straight to #1, which also is a first for a classic, for a classic to go upon publication straight to #1. But bear in mind that the market will always speak in terms of the old humanist values. So what they were saying is, we are publishing a classic. We're giving you a masterpiece. Nobody is going to say, I'm publishing a masterpiece, unfortunately only sell 20 copies, like Kafka did. Nobody will say that. When they say, I'm publishing a masterpiece, it means I expect it to sell 50 to 100,000 copies. But it will never say that. No publisher is going to say, I'm publishing a book which I think is going to sell a lot of copies, because the market always speaks in terms of value. Now, this is why value itself is suspect, has always been suspect. So I'm not talking about finding a world or inhabiting a world in which value might ever again be given properly, that good books be called good and bad books be called bad, but as Maurice Blanchard said, move towards an affirmation which doesn't have anything to do with value. This is why that uselessness that I'm talking about, the zero, which is neither one nor minus one, constitutes a metaphor for such an affirmation. What is that affirmation which is outside of this system of valuation? Valuation has always been suspect and now is completely entangled in capital stating itself, never as itself, but always as value. The world is full of value. The world is also full of capital stating itself. So it's important to find that useless space, which is not to do with value in that sense. Your second question was the hyperlink. And I think what you say is right. I'm looking at something to do with Matthew Arnold, and then off I go, into FIFA or whatever you said it was. But the opposite is also true. I think the hyperlink is a good thing also. Because, you know, a paper like The Guardian, for instance, which is the best paper in the UK, has over the decades and years whittled away at what they can publish in terms of the quirky and the idiosyncratic and the less important and the less useful. So if you look at the print version of The Guardian, mostly 90% of it will only have useful things in it. 10% or 5%, a writer who has some kind of reputation might slip in a discussion of something that is ostensibly useless. But generally, there's no room for it. But if you look at the net version of The Guardian on the internet, as you're reading a rather bland kind of obituary or report on somebody, maybe a writer, there will be, again, certain words, certain obscure figures, maybe that writer admired, a hyperlink, which will take you to this obscure figure, for whom there is no room in the print version in The Guardian. So in that sense, the hyperlink undermines this kind of very useful space that the newspaper is building up for itself, where it censors out whatever is marginal and out of the way and not ostensibly useful. And there I think the hyperlink plays a very, very important part in unwittingly extending what this newspaper sets out to do. Yes, uselessness is a spiritual practice, but one has to think about all these words because they are so loaded, and one ends up thinking of Sri Sri Ravi Shankar if one is not careful. But yes, yes, I mean, I agree with you that is certainly one valid way of looking at it. And I wish I had more time to talk about this, because one needs to figure out a language in which to talk about this tightrope walk. And the language itself is a tightrope walk. What your questions about negative capability, I agree. Keats used negative capability to speak about Shakespeare and a particular kind of writer, but I think negative capability, that is the ability to be in a state of irresolution, to not want resolution. He said this is what writers should be like. They should not want certainties and resolutions all the time. They should be happy to be in a state without any irritable, I think he uses the word irritable, searching after looking for fact and reason all the time. Fact and reason being legitimizing buttresses by which we sort of place something. So without always looking for that, to be in a state of irresolution, but this is also has to be true of the reader. The reader needs to participate in this process. The reader needs to be happy and train himself. Just as Benjamin says, I have to train myself to be in a state where I have lost myself. The reader has to train themselves to be lost and to be happy in that state of being lost. So that was your negative capability. You had another question, I think. Wolf. So Wolf, I think, hits the nail on the head to do with two different kinds of description. In her key essay, Mr. Bennett and Mrs. Brown, where she's actually arguing against Arnold Bennett, and Arnold Bennett has criticized her. What kind of writer is Virginia Woolf? We have no real characters in Woolf. What is this? So now we have forgotten Bennett's piece of criticism. What we remember is Woolf's essay, Mr. Bennett and Mrs. Brown, where she says that Bennett is a kind of writer who once he introduces a woman in his pages, will tell us what she looks like, what she's wearing, what the room looks like. Every piece of information then follows the model of the Renaissance with the human being at the center of the universe, whether it's in a painting or in a room or in a photographer's studio. Everything else is an accessory. The objects have no independent life. They are not there. The moment the objects begin to have an independent life, they have an kind of uselessness or superfluousness. What is it doing here? Why is it taking up so much space? Why is it drawing attention to itself? But for Woolf, Bennett's room, the room in which the woman is centered with the individual in it. And other things know their place. They're playing their parts in being a part of that individual story. They do not suddenly have their own life and story. So, I think in that sense, what Woolf is saying is, this is no way to arrive at a sense of reality or a sense of life. We cannot arrive at a sense of life by saying, I will put the individual in the center, I will describe her, and I will describe all the things that make up her life. This is no way of doing it. This is not what the world is like, with the human being's journey being at the center of it. And I think she makes it an extremely important point about how we look at and describe and think of the world and bring it to life as writers or filmmakers or creative artists. Not by giving one thing centrality and other things a subsidiary place, but moving centrality from one thing to another, from moment to moment, at every moment. So that was that. So there were two at the back. We can.
Yeah. I mean, if anybody has felt useless and the form of uselessness is out here, I don't know what I'm doing sitting on the stage.
Do you want to ask a question?
No, I don't want to.
I can't hear you, but just yeah.
So, your talk reminds me of an essay, actually by God, and he referred to Robert Mugabe. It's an essay called Lead Group. So, actually, he's discussing very similar issues, but with reference to the Indian classical literature. With reference to Kalidas especially. So I was wondering that you refer to the Gita and various philosophical, you charted a kind of philosophical image of this idea of uselessness. Could you reflect a bit on the literary tradition of uselessness? And it seems that we have, quite a glorified sort of tradition of uselessness in literature.
Thank you. I'd just like to refer to the parallel you drew between disinterested action, or the example of Bhagavad Gita, which you give for disinterested action, detachment and disinterest. Now, the point there is this concept of Nishkama Karma. It's about disinterest in the means, but with a definite kind of purpose in it, a moral purpose. There's an overarching moral purpose, and there's a righteous cause that has to be fought for and won. And in that cause, as later in the, not in the Gita, but in the Mahabharata, you have the slaying of Duryodhana and so on, there is even immoral means can be adopted. So is that a part of your category of uselessness? Because is a planner, when he sets out loitering to record the rhythms of life around him, is he driven by a moral purpose, or is he just there? Is he starting with an open mind, a blank slate? Or is it just they're completely receptive to every manner of impression without being in any sense morally judgmental? And the second, a small question is about referring to your own work, which I'm not very familiar with. I read a review which says that it revels in seeing the magical in the ordinary. Now, is that dichotomy of the magical and the ordinary, in a sense, symmetric with this creativity and uselessness that you're talking about here?
Just to take the issue of the thriller forward, there's a lot of conversation now about whether the way social media is creating certain forms of audiences. We are moving from the observer as the thriller to the observer creator as the Madon. Would you say that there is a certain truth in that?
The last bit of the question, the observer as?
The Madon. The walker, the one who watches and wows, rather than the disinterested observer that Benjamin wants the author to be.
Okay, so let me just try it.
One question?
That's the last one. Then I'll just answer them one by one.
Yeah.
Yeah, my question actually, it's basically like Sukumar's question, and I was, thinking, if you look at it from the perspective of a social scientist, the concept of usefulness that is outlined, does it even serve to kind of reaffirm the political and economic status quo? I mean, can it question the status quo? What causative, how, I mean,
sequentially rather than meander.
Yeah.
Okay? So the literary tradition, yeah, absolutely you're right. I think the Meghdut essay is very interesting, the Tagore's Meghdut essay, and I've written about it, and maybe I'm sort of not going to reply to your question directly, but offer my just some thoughts in response. Because yes, of course, I mean, I think ideas of uselessness arrive and become important with the exposure in the West to non-representational cultures. After the Renaissance, which kind of makes a fetish of representation, and neoclassicism, which makes a fetish of the human figure and representing the human figure in a particular way, the sudden kind of exposure to cultures which are not in that sense representational introduces a huge surplus of a particular kind, which becomes very important in modernity. There's no doubt about that. We haven't looked into it as much as we should have, and haven't looked into it either outside of the paradigm of influence, whether it's the East influencing the West or the West influencing the East, which is usually a dead end in terms of thinking about how these ways of imagining and how these transactions take place. Tagore's response to Kalidas, I mean, I'm not going to speak in terms of uselessness, but definitely in terms of how he's rethinking at every step what his inheritance might be. And because he chooses Kalidas, it doesn't mean that he chooses an Indian inheritance, because he views Kalidas as almost as a proto-modernist. So the things he is praising Kalidas for in his Meghdut essay have to do with Kalidas's powers of compression and obliqueness, as well as his ability to capture the sensory impact of the moment. So Tagore himself is very preoccupied with the momentary, with Khan or Kshan. You know, he's very preoccupied with that. But the example he gives from Kalidas is also about a moment. It's about a real sensory experience within that moment. The example from Meghdut, where he says, that wind has traveled from very far, and it carries with it the kind of the smell of resin and your presence, my beloved. You know, this line which he captures, which I cannot remember verbatim, this line which he quotes, which Tagore quotes, is a line about the momentary. It's not about an epic, overarching narrative that he's celebrating. He's saying, look at how Kalidas captures this in this perfect kind of sequence of words, this moment. And while doing so, he says, a writer like Shakespeare does not have a sense of the reality of the world. The word he uses for the reality of the world is, like nature. But this is what he means, but the reality of being alive in the world. He's saying Kalidas has that. Shakespeare doesn't. And Shakespeare has another characteristic or feature which Kalidas doesn't, which is verbosity. He says Shakespeare is verbose. Where Kalidas uses one word, Shakespeare uses 10. If you go back to this, you'll find that. So he's turning, as it were, James Mills's characterization of what Oriental writing is, what Indian writing is, and why it is so bad, on its head. The Mill says, it's a monstrously verbose kind of form of writing. The Mahabharata, the Ramayana, everything that the Indians do. And Macaulay echoes that when he says, all of it can be put into one kind of bookshelf, a Western bookshelf. The kind of figuration of the West being compressed and the East being verbose starts with Mills and then Macaulay with the library metaphor, that all of it could be fitted into one single bookshelf in a Western library. Tagore turns that on its head in the Meghdut essay and says our inheritance is elision, obliqueness, and compression, and the momentary. And this is how Kalidas is doing this. So what is interesting in the essay is how he's reconfiguring what our inheritance is. It's not what is important to him is not a straight one-to-one that he's a great Indian poet, I'm an Indian poet. That is not it at all. It's a whole reconfiguration of what literature comprises. What is literature and what is what we normally call Indian literature and Western literature. Let's overturn that altogether through Kalidas. This is the agenda in that essay. That was Mahabharata.
I mean, whether...
What was it? Sorry, it's coming back, but, huh? No more, yeah. So I think that's a very interesting question because you bring up two different kinds of ambiguity or amorality. You bring up what is very, very attractive in the Mahabharata, but also is an aspect of the Bhagavad Puran. That is a playful, mischievous, amoral Krishna. And this is almost an Ovidian Krishna. Krishna will not be one shape, one thing, keeps metamorphosing. We do not know who this person is. But in the Gita, we have whatever the idea of the larger moral framework and righteous action, we have an idea of passionate detachment or detached but passionate action. And this paradox feeds directly, I think, into ideas of impersonality in both critical and creative writing. Arnold is interested as the experience of reading a poem and taking pleasure in a poem not being a completely personal task or a personal pleasure, that there is something impersonal in it. Flaubert is interested, as is Eliot, in saying that writing a poem or writing a novel is just not an expression of my feelings and my personality. It is done by me with great passion, but it is not reducible to just me telling you what I feel or what is important to me. There is a degree of not self-expression, but self-annihilation in it. So that tightrope walk begins, where we want to extinguish ourselves, but want to be in control, to master our way of doing it. So in Flaubert, we are talking about a particular kind of mastery that involves, paradoxically, loss of control, loss of self-consciousness. That connects it to the Krishna of the Gita, rather than this Ovidian, amoral Krishna of the Bhagavad Puran and the Mahabharata. So that's my answer to your question. And I think there is a direct connection and correlation there with Arnold reading the Gita, but also Eliot reading the Gita, and Eliot reading up on Buddhism, and it being very important to him. These ideas of impersonality, whether we are expressing ourselves or annihilating ourselves, run through his critical work. Then there was your question. So, again, I mean, I have no direct answer. I can only offer thought associations in response to what you've said. But I would say that Benjamin spoke about the flaneur. He spoke about also the importance of the crowd. And when he spoke about the importance of the crowd, he also spoke about the fact that the crowd wanted to read about itself, or wanted to see itself represented. Since we are talking about cultural shifts, let's talk about a cultural shift beginning from that perspective. So he said a great cultural shift came about in the 19th century, where what was the entitlement of the rich earlier, which is having their own portraits painted. So you commission a painter, come and paint my portrait, became something that every man in the crowd was entitled to. They wanted to see themselves in the novel. So he says the rise of the novel is linked to this desire that the man in the crowd had to see himself portrayed, as the earlier kind of entitled patrons commissioned people to see themselves portrayed. And certainly that is one way of interpreting that shift in which the novel arises. And then takes us out of a very sort of, the boundary of a drawing, of a rarefied drawing room into a more kind of diffuse world. I think I think another very important shift occurs when karaoke happens. And when karaoke happens, people no longer just want to see themselves represented in a book or hear their feelings represented or sung about in a pop song. They want to be, for a little while, the singer or the artist themselves. So if in the 19th century a shift occurred where we wanted to see ourselves represented, another shift occurred in the 80s where we wanted to occupy the position of the creative artist. And this is also a seminal shift. It has had its downside, and it also is full of potential. So the downside, of course, we know that as the Croatian writer Dubravka Ugresic wrote, because she noted that skiers and celebrity chefs and others who are champion kind of athletes who are writing their memoirs were getting reviewed and their books were selling, but writers themselves didn't know what to do. So she wrote that it is easy for a champion skier to become a writer, but it's not easy for a writer to become a champion skier. So this is the post-karaoke moment, where a seminal shift occurs to do with the ontology of creativity. Who is the creator? It's as seminal and as liberating potentially, though the downside of it is very apparent to us now, as an earlier move from representation in the late 19th century occurred when we began to think, what is art? What is a painting? I mean, the first critics went and saw the Impressionists and Monet or whoever. Is this a painting? Today, there is this other moment. Who is the artist? So that shift has occurred. This is just a kind of response to what, a kind of thought association that came from your question. Was there one last one?
That was Pallavi.
Pallavi. And Pallavi's question was, to just remind me.
It was also Mala.
Basically on the causative value of the concept of usefulness in leading, causing historical change. I mean, I'm saying this way of this idea of uselessness, can it also not serve to reaffirm the existing status quo?
I don't know, maybe it can, but I think it also challenges in India and challenges outside it also, but certainly in India, a particular status quo which is heavily dependent on ideas of legitimacy. I think Indian thinking has taken a backseat to the Indian desire, and when we're using the word Indian, of course, I'm generalizing hugely. But let's say even in academia, even in Anglophone academia, thinking has taken a backseat to the desire for legitimacy. So the way, for instance, Ram Guha describes the right-wing individual, demagogue, the right-wing demagogue, as opposed to the left-wing intellectual, is interesting. Because he says the intellectual is a person who researches his work properly and gets it peer-reviewed and publishes it in scholarly journals. And the demagogue is a person who doesn't back up what he says, his certainties, and just declares them out of some sort of ideological position. So this lack of backing up on the right-wing person's part is basically a lack of having observed the conventions that would legitimize what they were saying. There is no argument with right-wing thinking. Thinking has to be engaged with as thought and presented as thought. The left way of thinking is not important because it has been backed up, but because it is a form of thinking, it is a form of thought, it challenges us to respond. Whether it is legitimate or not is a different issue. It need not be legitimate according to, so one might be writing these things in a completely illegitimate way, as Benjamin and various other people did, within illegitimate spaces. We have lost our sense of these illegitimate spaces. We want everything, so the whole function of fact and archive, all of these are functions of legitimizing. The thought process itself, which one has to engage with, becomes invisible, non-existent, secondary. So it is very important through bringing back uselessness into the frame to say that we have to think beyond, we have to stop falling back on legitimization as our default way of thinking and enter into a thought process itself. The thought process is obviously a form of uselessness in that sense.
I finally let you know. All right.
I'm so sorry.
Thank you
Thank you so much. Thank you.